Okay, so hello everyone. I've got this very special pleasure of announcing the presentation of Lúcia Sá. And let me briefly introduce Lúcia. She's a professor of Brazilian studies at the University of Manchester. She is the author of Rainforest Literatures, Amazonian Texts and Latin American Cultures, and of various articles on Amazonian indigenous cultures. She was the principal investigator for the Arts and Humanities Research Council project named Racism and Anti-Racism in Brazil, the Case of Indigenous Peoples, and is currently a co-investigator in the Arts and Humanities Research Council project Cultures of Anti-Racism in Latin America. Today's presentation is named The Economic Foundation of a Vast Empire, Plant Monoculture in Brazilian Literature. Lúcia, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Patricia, and the whole team for inviting me to this very special event about monocultures. Okay, from the first arrival of the Portuguese in the territory that now is called Brazil, there was the idea that the vegetation that was there, the Atlantic forest or Mata Atlântica, would have to be replaced by something more useful, more profitable. The first plants of sugarcane arrived in Brazil in the first decades already of the 16th century. By 1560, the growing and production of sugar had become the main economic activity in Brazil and continued to be so for at least a century, when precious metals were found in Minas Gerais. Even after Brazil lost the position of the first producer of sugar and the most important producer of sugar to the West Indies in 1690, sugar remained a major element in Brazilian economy and social life. The first pages of Gilberto Freire's 1937 Nordeste or Northeast famously declare monoculture as the most significant of the three elements responsible for the woes of Brazilian society. I'll read just bits of the quote, which is there in Portuguese for you. Monoculture, slavery, and latifundia, but principally monoculture, they open the deepest wounds here in the life, the landscape, and the character of our people. End of quote. Although in this book, Freire talks about the landscape, about the environmental consequences of monoculture, most of his work in the 1930s was dedicated, as we know, to what was its effects or the effects of monoculture on society and its lasting legacy of inequality and of Brazilian continued reliance on exploitation of labor and servitude. Well, what I want to do in this paper is to examine how monoculture appears in literature, in Brazilian literature. The best known portraits of sugar monoculture are the novels that integrate José Lins do Rego sugar cycle or Ciclo da Cana, and I will be dealing with them later. But first, I would like to talk about the novel O Cabeleira or Long Hair by Franklin Távora, published in 1876. Normally described as part of Brazil's Romantic movement, O Cabeleira is inspired by the life of a Rio bandit that roamed the province of Pernambuco in the 19th century, a mixed race, part indigenous, part white man, that left a legacy of assassinations and robbery throughout the northeast region of Brazil. The volume opens with a letter to a friend of the author's in Switzerland, where he invokes not the Northeast, but the Amazon, as, and I quote, a new world where anyone entering for the first time will see that no fellow humans preceded him, where many leagues have not yet been trodden by civilized men, and where rivers have only been navigated by the Indian canoes. The text rehearses the myth of the virgin forest, so often associated with the Amazon. The fact that Indian canoes are mentioned side by side with the idea that the place had not been penetrated by anybody, by fellow travelers, makes it very clear that indigenous people are not fellows of the civilized man. But this wondrous image is soon replaced by what the narrator calls a descent into the lowlands of positivism, which would eventually help eliminate the specter of the dark forests. He then imagines the fate if in this world the river margins became cities, right? If agriculture would free its treasures in these plains, if factories filled the air with the smoke and the noise of their machines. The sometimes static and sometimes violent beauty of the forest would then be able to generate income, which, with the mobilization of proper credits and markets, would give rise to new Manchesters and new New Yorks. Agriculture, cities and factories, in other words, civilization, are the antidote to the dark forests, as they will provide the, quote again, indispensable agents of civilization and human greatness, labor, capital, economy, plentifulness, and wealth, which will fight nakedness and hunger. From this description of the Amazon, which clearly it becomes a blueprint in a way for all the attempts that will happen later, including by the military in the 1970s, of what they called developing the Amazon. From this description, we go medium rebus into the action, with Cabeleira, his father, and one of their accomplices performing some robberies that included a church in Recife and being pursued by the state army. True to Távора's romantic affiliation, as Cabeleira flees the forces, the police and soldiers, he reconnects with a childhood love, a young woman called Luizinha, whose mother he had just killed. To prove his love for her, he abandons his weapons, and after he dies, he's forced. After she dies, he's forced to hide. As he flees, the coastal region of the province from Alagoas to Paraíba was cut off from the sertão by a cordon sanitaire made up of soldiers. The cordon sanitaire was erected to physically separate the coast from the sertão, used by Távora, similar to many authors of the time, in the sense of interior or deserto, desert, and being, again, as with most authors of the time, as the natural destination for bandits and malefactors. Cabeleira, however, manages to escape the pursuit of the soldiers, generating legends and stories that he was hiding in the unknown and fear-inducing sertões far away. As a matter of fact, Cabeleira had not gone far, but was instead exploring new routes to his place of birth. In his mind, no legal system, and here's the quote, would be able to extract her from the shady dens and unfathomable caves perpetually open to the jaguars and to himself, and perpetually shut to all other animals and men who would dare to penetrate their dark, who would not dare to penetrate their dark thresholds, fearful of being forever buried in such ghastly sarcophagi. The trope of impenetrability of the unknown sertões, very common to many authors in the 19th century Brazil, acquires a specific vocabulary in Távora, associated with darkness, caves, and death, and accessible only to humans and predator animals alike. Drought and extreme heat make the area even more inhospitable and cruel. And despite the fact that the soldiers are, like Cabeleda, described as rustic men, they cannot find him. For he disappears amongst the vegetation, or mato, like a fish in the river. And all they can find are jaguars and rattlesnakes. The wild, undeveloped environment indistinguishably called sertão, floresta or forest, mato, or deserto, desert, can only be known by malefactors, savages, and dangerous beasts. That's what the novel says repeatedly. By contrast, when characters come across cultivated farms, the narrator highlights the calm and happiness brought by labor and productivity. Eventually, even though Cabeleda knows the local environment, he cannot find any food in the mato forest, and hunger forces him to leave his hideaway in the same way, the novel says, that it makes birds migrate and the fierce beasts to leave their dens. Starved, he wanders until he finds a sugar plantation and looks for a new hiding place amidst the sugarcane, which the narrator described as the plant that was destined to become the main staple and wealth of a vast empire, right? So it says in the beginning here, he could stay for months in that kind of a paradise, right? So the nutritious and precious juice would offer him nutrition. But there was a mistake. The plantation, differently from Sertão, is a completely controlled space and was being guarded by slaves who called the soldiers. The engenho owner orders the plantation, the sugarcane, to be cut down, and Cabeleda is captured and killed. Wild nature, whether it's forest, sertão, or desert, and they are interchangeable in the novel, breeds lower passions, violence, savagery, and makes men, that is, in this novel, men racialized as descendants of indigenous peoples, indistinguishable from beasts. The sertão cannot nourish humans. It only offers them dangers and death. Tamed nature, on the other hand, which is the fruit of hard labor, can overcome even natural disasters such as a drought. For Távora, there can be no place in the new nation like Brazil for untamed, unknown sertões. All sertões, deserts, and forests have to be explored, mapped, and cultivated so that they cannot become hiding places for savagery, violence, or banditry. And the ideal way of cultivating it is monoculture, like sugarcane. Let me now move on to a few decades to José Lins do Rego, who wrote 5 novels that form part of what he himself calls the sugarcane cycle, or ciclo da cana, between 1932 and 1943. Menino de Engenho, 1932, Doidinho, 33, Banguê, 34, Usina, 36, and Fogo Morto, 1943. Son of a mill owner and a personal friend of Gilberto Freire, with whom he reportedly discussed intensely at the time the latter was writing Casagrande Senzala, Casagrande Senzala, Lins do Rego has been studied with regards to the social order he describes and the relationships, above all, the relationships between humans, above all, patriarchal relationships between the plantation owner, the descendants of the former slaves, and the intergenerational conflict that sees the decadence of sons who cannot maintain control of their workers and productions as their father was able to maintain. There's also intense conflict and competition between neighboring owners. The characters reappear in different novels at different times of their lives. patriarchal order is seen as repressive to women and to other forms of gender relationship. The context is one of crisis of the monoculture of sugar, a permanent crisis, to use Frank's description in the lecture the day before yesterday. My idea for this paper was to reread the novels of José Lins do Rego to look for descriptions of sugarcane, like physical descriptions of sugarcane. But that I should have perhaps expected, I didn't find many. What we have in most of the novels is a silence on the discussion of what the sugarcane looks like, apart from very schematic, in passing descriptions that say that it's green and it moves with the wind. That is repeated again and again. Instead, sugarcane is described as part of processes of the process of producing sugar. Two examples from the first novel, Menino de Engenho. So one example describes the flooding, the periodic flooding, and the other one describes with excitement from the point of view of a child, the beginning of the grinding time of the processing of the sugarcane. Descriptions of landscape in the novel are reserved not for the sugarcane, but for the large cashew trees, the cajá trees, the joá trees, the genipapo trees, which allow the characters to meet underneath or shelter, or describe actually the pleasure they have in their appearance. So the first novel, Menino de Engenho, sets the character Carlos, who's a child at the time when he went to live with his grandfather. The point of view is definitely from a white grandson of the mill owner. Descriptions take another tone in Usina, which represents a change from the engenho, the sugar mill, to the usina, or the sugar plant, or a factory production. The novel tells the story of Dr. Juca, who, having bought more land at the time in which the price of sugar was very high, decides to invest into an even a bigger production, a factory plant of sugar. He becomes very rich, buys a mansion in Paraíba, cars, automobiles, which were new in the place at the time, and lives with his family a luxurious lifestyle. There are now many descriptions of the canaviais, the sugar plantations, as they take over everything and change the social and environmental order. Okay, sorry, this is the point of view, yeah. So here we go. So, for example, in Usina, Bom Jesus took Bom Jesus is the name of the farm, of the plant, the sugar plant, took everything they had, taking over the floodplain, cutting down the orange trees, destroying the fields, making the people go up to the Caatinga. Teodoro is a descendant of a slave, is a black man. Misfortune was not his alone. If you left the floodplain, not outside, if you just left the floodplain, sorry, I used Google Translate, all you could see was sugarcane fields. Where were Lucinda's girls' farm? Where was Lucinda's girls' farm? The dark clay house, the joá tree, the genipapo tree, the old rose bushes that produce roses that grew withered. The mill, or the plant actually, had eaten. The plant had scraped, the sugar plant had scraped, filled with sugarcane. And what about the old potter's house with its clay oven? God had allowed, I think I'll replace plant because that's ambiguous for usina. So usina means sugar plant, the factory type of sugar plant. And I will use that word from now. The usina God had allowed the usina to eat everything. Where during the engenho, the mill monoculture, workers planted their own food sweet potatoes, bananas, manioc, cashews, including on the floodplains. Now we are told, now they are told to leave and move out. There is no space for anything but sugarcane. Everyone asked him, that is Dr. Juca, what the hell he wanted so much land for. He knew what he needed it for. Usina was not satisfied, was never satisfied. Usina was always asking for more land. Not happy with the yield, Dr. Juca decides to invest in an even more modern plant to become even richer. For that, he gets into debt with banks, uses money from relatives, buys machinery from the US, hires an engineer, chemistry specialists to create a sugar plant unlike anything never seen in Paraíba. The sugarcane production also pollutes the river, as we can see in the next slide. And it continued like this until today. No one lived in the floodplains anymore. Even in the old cemetery, which they said that belonged to the Indians, they planted sugarcane. And the smelly syrup from the usina poured into the river. It stank from afar. That disgusting thing got stuck in the sand, and the vultures spent the day on it. It stank all the way down the river, and it fell into a well. No one could take a bath anymore when the river was dry. Poço das Pedras looked like a mud flat, with vultures on top of the flagstones, as if they were after carrion. The world had changed in Santa Rosa being the place. And another description of environmental changes, the usina had stripped Paraíba of its goodness, pissing on it that stinking syrup, precisely during the times of drought. It transformed that white bed, greened by reeds and parsley, into a little channel through which a trickle of mud ran. The Paraíba River of today was a vulture camp. The migratory birds fled from it, looking for other watering holes for their thirsts. Dr. Juca also changed the course of a smaller river, the Vertente, and people had then no clean water to drink. Train line was brought specially into the usina, into the plant. Hundreds of workers were now managed by someone who did not know them, and Dr. Juca himself was living in the city and losing contact with the land. From the beginning of the novel, there are forms of foreshadowing that convince us that things are not going to go well. There is also the view of Negro Feliciano, who predicts that things are going to go wrong and that the mighty Paraíba River will take revenge. And things go wrong. The machines do not work as they should, so the first production does not happen, does not yield. The next production is disappointing, and Dr. Juca has to spend more money on engineers and machinery. The price of sugar goes down, and the plant inevitably is going to have to be bought by Dr. Juca's competitor, the owner of a neighboring sugar plant. At the end, he has to sell the usina to his enemy, and the river, the smaller river, Vertente, dries up, there is drought, and the people who used to live in the lands of the Engenho go hungry. There is a general famine, that is described as something like nothing else that had ever happened before in the region, because before they could always resort to a few of their little animals, a few of their trees, and now they have nothing left. So when hunger hits, there's nothing that can help them. With the disappointing yield and the great sugar crisis, Dr. Juca will go bankrupt, and the neighbor or enemy takes over for almost nothing, buying the land for almost nothing. The people who had been robbed of their vertente little river sabotage the dam, and the river goes back to its original course. When the Vertente River began to run across the floor of the old bed, oh, sorry, this is a quote. Then the Vertente River, began to run across the floor of his old bed. It's very personalized here. One whole day, while the bricklayers were repairing the spout, the water from the Vertente poured into the ground for its bygone days. It soaked the earth, washed the pebbles from its old parched bed. Its waters had not felt the heat of the sun for more than 3 years. The sun had not come to shine over them, and the clouds had not looked across its waters. Vertente ran, bouncing like a schoolboy, leaving his punishment for recess. He spread out, he did good, while the Bon Jesus bricklayers beat bricks and made limestone so that he could once again be confined in that long old pit of his. Finally, at the end of the novel, the mighty Paraíba River, which had already caused floods in the previous novels, destroys all the machinery and floods in all the local plants. So this novel and the whole cycle of sugarcane novels of José Lins do Rego, but particularly this novel, which is the one I'm talking about, has usually been read as nostalgic for the old engenho. So the usina is a new order that replaces an old order that was seen as preferable. And that's true. There is an element of nostalgia and a sense that things were better for the poor at the time of the engenho. But it's always described as a relative better. The old order and the grandfather were seen as repressive of the poor, and also repressive of all kinds of gender freedom. This is very important in José Lins do Rego. So there is nostalgia, but it's a relative nostalgia. What strikes me reading the novel today, besides this issue of nostalgia that undoubtedly is there, is that to me, more important than the nostalgia is how the storyline could be the storyline of almost any narrative about monoculture. This novel, written in the 1930s, could describe, with, of course, contextual differences, any story or any narrative of monoculture. What strikes me is how little the narrative of monoculture changes. And this takes me back from the talk on yesterday by Frank Wickert that about monoculture, about the magic thinking of monoculture. The elements are all there: patriarchy, masculinity, the license to be greedy, the idea that one can improve the land, all the voices against monoculture. So all of those elements that characterize in the talk that we heard in this symposium about monoculture, they're there, right? And they're there in a story that takes place with sugarcane, specifically in the 1930s. But as I'm saying, it repeats it. It's the environmental destruction, the patriarchal dominance, the belief that things are going to be better, the belief that monoculture itself needs more and more and more and more. And on top of it, there is, of course, the exploitation of the poor, and the fact that the poor with monoculture, they have nowhere to go. And in the case of José Lins do Rego, the element of race is there very clearly marked as well. The poor are the former descendants of slaves, right? So that's very, very clear. And the only voices against monoculture are, of course, the voices of the victims, the poor who have to move from the floodplains, who do not have the possibility of planting anymore, but they describe themselves as victims of that process. But there is another voice, and it's the voice of the old black man, Feliciano, who is seen as kind of mad by other characters in the novel, but who appeals to another form of knowledge, a form of knowledge that tells him that the river is going to take revenge. And that is very, very important. And because the prophecy, that prophecy that appears as a kind of mad kind of discourse seen by other characters throughout the novel, we kind of know that is going to prevail, and it does prevail. And what we have at the end is a point of view that includes, as we see in the last quote, the view from the river as a kind of a live being. The river reacquires its happiness, its buoyancy, and goes back to its natural bed. And similarly, in the description of the Paraíba comes and takes over everything and destroys, there is, so we have the little river, and we have the point of view of the Paraíba River, the big river that destroys everything. And that possibility of the revenge of nature against monoculture, that's presented from a system of knowledge that is alternative from the system of knowledge, which is capitalism, basically, that organizes the narrative of monoculture. That's it. That's the end of the talk. Thank you very much.